Hello, East is a podcast. This is not Cena. This show has been hijacked by two East is a podcast fans located in the Sonoran Desert. My name is Alex Aviña. You probably have heard me on this podcast a couple of times before. Cena has allowed me to borrow East as a podcast so I could interview and talk with a friend and a comrade located in Tucson, Taylor Miller. Um, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today on this special guest episode of East as a podcast. Yeah, we can start off by you talking a little bit about yourself, and then we can dive in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, particularly two of your articles.
Sure, absolutely. Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much, Alex. This is really cool. This is a great opportunity. And yes, two Arizonans, so that's pretty exciting. I'm a little bit further south, and right now the clouds are moving in here, the monsoon madness. Very excited about it. But my name's Taylor, and I recently completed, well, I say recently, but I guess that's like several years ago now, but I completed my doctorate in geography at the University of Arizona, political geography, urban geography, with a focus on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, gentrification practices, if you will, but just basically occupation by the more sort of banal, sort of routinized cultural practices that otherwise sort of go sort of unnoticed or unseen or are unremarkable to like a sort of a less attuned eye, if you will. I also completed my MFA, no, my MA and my BA in art and visual culture education at the University of Arizona, museum studies. And so, I bring sort of like the art world and the political geography world together into a mess that only makes sense to my to my brain sometimes. I don't know.
How's that working out professionally, Taylor?
It's well,
Academia really not friendly to your, amazing approach. So
no, but well, I mean, thank you for that. And you're just like one of a handful of folks who I think sort of know my plight on the job market. If anybody's listening and wants to hire me, but no, it's like it's richly qualitative if we want to put it in that terms. But these vernacular cartographies, the term psychogeography, which like honestly is a terrible term because when you put it out there and people are like, what are you studying? Or are you a psychologist? I don't know. No, but it's wayfinding, it's experiential learning, but I don't have GIS skills, and so I'm not marketable.
yeah. So the reason, thank you, Taylor. The reason why I invited you today to help me hijack East as a podcast is to talk about two articles that you've published in the last 6-7 months, that have blown me away. Especially the first one, which is titled "A Pause on Possibility," which you published in December of last year in the Avery Review, and then this latest one that you published in June, titled "The University of Arizona's Institutionalized Border Violence." And both of these have to do with Palestine, with settler colonialism, both sparked by Al-Aqsa flood, right, and what happened on October 7th. And in particular, I remember, reading your first piece, "A Pause on Possibility," not just being blown away by the writing and the writing style, which I felt was so rich, powerful, and compelling, but you published this in a moment where not many writers in the West were writing about October 7th the way that you were, right? Like, you start with that Miriam Marguti tweet about Gaza just broke out of a prison, right? And so it was really interesting that you were writing about October 7th and what had followed in a way that was radically different from what we were getting bombarded with, right, in the mainstream media. Um, and then the second piece that you published, following the encampments, right? You trace the development of encampments at the University of Arizona. I think you offer really interesting answers to why the university answered so brutally and so violently to the various attempts at organizing encampment. But then you give us this really rich, X-ray of the border military industrial complex that currently exists at the University of Arizona. So hopefully we can jump into both. But if you want to begin just in a general way, or if you want to begin with a pause on possibility and thinking about October 7th and why, what led you to write this piece in December? What were you thinking when you wanted to write this piece?
Oh my gosh. Well, in all honesty, so much of the writing that's sprung forth or even that's sitting in my journals, sort of just tinkering about, is just catharsis. It's just a way for me to process what's going on. Um, you know, I think at the time of recording right now, there's at least 38,000 Gazans that have been murdered and counting. It's always in rising. 15,000 of those are children. I read the other day that 21,000 plus children are, presently presumed to be in mass graves and missing. I begin that piece in the Avery Review foremost with, like you said, Mariam's tweet, because that's how I found out about it. And I'm really not on Twitter. I've told you before, I only use Twitter to like troll the State Department. It's like not my, like, I'm kind of anonymous, not anonymous on it, but like I don't care about it. I just like read, Blinken's tweets and stuff. Anyways, I opened it
That's
up
really
and
healthy, really healthy.
really, really healthy. It's like for CENTCOM updates and like, Floyd's updates. And we'll get to that a little bit later because this language is actually really integral to how I'm thinking through a lot of this. But, I saw her tweet and I've followed her for many years. I wrote about some of her work in my doctoral dissertation. She, for me, is one of the foremost sources and voices documenting the atrocity in the West Bank and beyond. And it was those words where I thought like, oh my gosh, like something is happening, right? And sure enough, the flood. And even just that idea of the flood, being a longtime desert dweller. I don't know, there's just like so many points of connection. But anyways, thinking about foremost, the massacre of all of these children, right? All of these life worlds, all of these families, these entire families completely obliterated from the registry. Before anything on a CV or any kind of thinking, I'm a mom. Like that's who I am. And that's what my life is built around. And I have a young daughter. She just turned 5. And I just can't process this, we're so far removed, but also we're not, because every second that we open our phone, there's another image. And it's like every next day, every next moment is the absolute rock bottom, most grotesque vignette that we can't even imagine, conjure up until it's in front of us. And it's just resonating and festering, and it's keeping me awake at night. And so I'm trying to write through that, writing through it as a mom, writing through it as somebody who, if anybody wants to read these few essays, somebody who has 3 degrees from the University of Arizona that to me are receipts of this atrocity because of the University of Arizona. And as we're increasingly connecting the dots, virtually every university has a hand, bloodied hands, as part of this. So it's like it's in placement, it's experiential in the sense of like being a mom and aligning my motherhood, like what good is my motherhood if not non-parsable from every other mother's and children's thriving existence. And so it's like a very long-winded, nonsensical way of just saying like, I'm thinking through this at home. I'm thinking through this at the playground. I'm thinking through this constantly and connecting the dots between like, the Caterpillar headquarters that's down the street from my house, the Raytheon headquarters that's down the street from my house, and all these other businesses, and of course the border wall technologies that are all within earshot, literally, and how everything that's going on here in Tucson, in my neighborhood, in the Sonoran Desert, in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands connects so intimately with what we're seeing in Gaza, with what we're seeing all across Palestine, way before October 7th, but of course from October 7th moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's the connecting threads between both articles. And I guess this is like the theme of our conversation, right? It's the walls, right? Walls and what walls do, what walls don't do. And you have this line in the piece that I think this is the line that stood out to me the most the first time I read it. When you wrote, quote, "We need to remember they hang glided over the damn wall," right? So again, it was so striking to see in like a Western media outlet or literary platform to see somebody write about October 7th in that way, right? Like it's because I think there's less, I want to think that there's less fear about people in the West and the United States in particular that's financing and arming and facilitating this horrific genocide, that more people are willing to come out and to, call this what it is. But you were, what struck me in December was you saying like, talking about the paragliders in a way that was radically different from what we're seeing on social media or in just mainstream media outlets, right? Like, and including people in the West, right? I mean, I think one of the, we can come back to this if you want, but the, large segments of the so-called Western left and the reactions to October 7th and what has followed since then, I think has been shameful, right? And we've seen so many pieces of the so-called decent left or the responsible left that would talk shit about your particular sentence about hang gliding over the damn wall. And so one way we can get into this conversation, think about what do these walls do? Like what's the connection between your neighborhood in Tucson, your city in Tucson, the U.S. Mexico borderlands with Gaza, with Palestine? Why do activist writers often refer to the U.S. Mexico border as like the Palestine-Mexico border? Like how can we, let's dive deeper into your work, particularly in this article.
Sure, absolutely. And I just want to sort of the caveat is that I'm standing on the shoulders of people who have already done an immense amount of work here. Who have been writing and thinking about these spaces and living these atrocities, for decades. Journalists like Todd Miller, Jeff Boyce, and of course the OTAM activists that have been tirelessly pushing back against the wall. And so I guess that really is the core of my research and writing, is to like lean into what's already been done and then further parse out those connections. But the Palestine-Mexico border, oof, I mean, well, first of all, I hope that listeners know that the jurisdiction of CBP, Customs and Border Patrol or Protection, is 100 miles in every direction. And so if you're listening in New York, if you're listening in Seattle, if you're listening in LA, like, you are within CBP's jurisdiction. It's not just here at the US Mexico, border wall. But yeah, so in Tucson, I'm about 60 miles away from the wall. But the Tucson Border Patrol sector is about 90,000 square miles, I believe. And I also believe that it's one of the largest Border Patrol sectors. But it's the nature of it, how this like Medusae creeps into every corner, every little like space in the city, is really what fascinates me and angers me and makes me nauseous every day. And Elbit is, of course, one of the major players, and they're based in Haifa, but a lot of the production and the contracts are all here in the United States. Elbit and Anduril are sort of the two main players with the surveillance towers, the IFTs, the integrated fixed towers, that are the physical structures. That's the thing, these virtual walls, everything is a material, right? And I'm going to bounce around, and that's just kind of like my brain in a washing machine, so I apologize for that. But, I don't think we necessarily need to go through like a chronology of the border wall here. No, nor do we really even need to talk about prevention through deterrence and, the 1994 policies. Like 1994 is this horrific year of death making and enclosure here, because you have NAFTA taking hold, you have prevention through deterrence taking hold. And that was really during the Clinton administration when things ramped up. The billions started to funnel in towards border securitization. And, after different iterations of the physical wall took form, and some of them failed, right, then Obama started to lean into this so-called virtual wall, but they all have these physical sites, these physical structures of these towers. And so Elbit and Anduril are the two main businesses that are contracted here. And there's just a host of other, defense contractors that have so many tentacles in every facet of life that, it is wild to me. And so I've really begun to sort of pull that apart. And I'm looking at the ways in which, ASU up in your campus, but also U of A, they're invested in these technologies. They're benefiting and profiting from these technologies and these partnerships. I don't even think I answered your question. I don't know where my brain is going.
One of the things that stood out to me about your article is that you situate, essentially what you're showing is like, okay, how Arizona or specific locales in Arizona in the US Mexico borderline is like directly responsible to what's happening and what has happened in Palestine, right? Not just after October 7th, but before, right? So, you have different forms of settler colonialisms learning, from one another and feeding off of each other. But there is something happening at the U.S. Mexico borderlands that is very, gringo to a certain extent, right? Like it speaks to different like historical and political genealogies, but but they've been in conversation with Israeli forms of settler colonialism. So basically, like American walls are learning from Israeli walls and vice versa. And I don't know if you saw the president of Colombia's Gustavo Petro's quote. I think it was like the last climate change, these useless climate change conferences, where he made a very clear point about saying, look, like Gaza's the future, is like the dress rehearsal for the future. And he's connecting Gaza and climate change to migration, and he makes this really compelling argument that what the genocide that Israel's committing on Palestinians in Gaza is a dress rehearsal for how the West is going to react to mass human movement and displacement caused by climate change, right? And he has this line where he says something like, Hitler is knocking at the doors of middle class homes in the West and in the United States and in Europe, and many of them have opened the door to let him in. So it's interesting, that kind of thinking and your work that situates settler colonialism comparatively in Arizona and in Palestine changes both historically and politically how we view this phenomenon, right? Like the origin of the United States gets completely recast or reframed if this is our departure point. But it's something similar happens to Israel, right? If we look at Zionism as a political project from its foundation, prior to its foundation, to today, like what we look at it in a way that situates it or centers or grounds settler colonialism as the main way to look at it through walls. That obviously recast the way that we have to look at this project. And I think part of the struggle now, the ideological struggle that we're witnessing politically in the so-called mainstream, is a struggle over that, right? I think, and so for for I would say people like you and me, when we see these images of kids just going through just things that they should never have to go through, right? Like our reaction is the reaction that you described, right? Like we can't sleep at night, that we keep seeing the images, we feel anger, we feel rage, we need to do something. But I also, like, there's many other people who don't see it that way, right? Because their framing of the United States, their framing of Israel is radically different. But if we situate it just by looking at walls and by thinking about settler colonialisms in a comparative way, I mean, the story obviously changes, right? So I wonder, it is like a really long-winded way to get to my next question or thought. What is it about the militarized borderlands in the U.S. and Mexico shared borderlands that led you to Israel and to Palestine? Like beyond the obvious connections, right? Elbit is the obvious one, the technology, the virtual one, the defense contractors. But how did you get there? Like, how did you, as someone who was working and researching in Tucson, like how did your attention, how did you get to your focus on Palestine?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm glad that we both had like very. We're like talking about walls, and we're like, are we going over them? Are we going through them? Are we going under them? Yes, and okay. So actually, my current fixation, my research interests, this increasing attention paid to connecting the dots between, or building on this Palestine-Mexico border, came after field work and studying in Palestine. So I've I won't even go down that there's probably something psychoanalytic and all of that, but I was raised in like a very traditional Jewish household, and it never made sense to me. Like, the teachings and sort of like the traditions and the customs and sort of like this very sort of trite regurgitation on the part of my dad. Shout out to dad that I don't talk to. That is my sort of baseline for understanding the occupation. It's this like these sort of logics or excuses or the Hasbara, the propaganda that goes into fueling this machine. And so I was raised in one way, and like, I'm laying awake at night all the time now these days. But I just remember myself at the dinner table, like every Shabbat dinner, right? It was just me and my mom and dad, and I would like slither down underneath the table when I was a little kid, when my dad would start like reading things from the Torah, because I'm like, this is stupid, and I don't want to do it. But it was like this indoctrination that just didn't stick. It didn't land for me, and at the time, I didn't have the vocabulary or any kind of support, or really any kind of like outlet for contestation, or that kind of criticality that hopefully I have now, or that I'm always adding to now. But that was my inroad for wanting to understand Judaism as connects with Palestine, as connects with the IOF, as connects with these materials of enclosure and violence. And so, I write in some of my pieces, maybe, but especially in my dissertation, where it's like, I shouldn't have even been doing field work there. Like, I know this now. And, there's so much like sort of guilt that comes with that idea of having been, or rather having practiced ethnographic field work in Palestine, despite thinking like you're doing the good work and you're making the good connections. But that freedom of movement that I had, my privilege, right, to come and go and to have the visa and whatever, I spent a lot of time there, and I'm so grateful because I was able to see firsthand, to have the sniper in your face at Colombia checkpoint, or, to be stuck in traffic in Ramallah, or, to like see the settler violence all across Al-Quds. But the brunt of my time was spent in Tel Aviv, and understanding how, this like palimpsest of destruction is just so naturalized, and it's just sort of part of like this neoliberal push to like beautify the space and sell off real estate and hawk the land and this and that, but really it's built on top of, Yafa and Al-Manshia. Anyways, when I was younger and just starting school, I was there a lot, and I was supposed to continue with some field work right at the pandemic's onset. Of course, everything shuts down, and now I have a very young baby, and I'm in Tucson all the time, of course. And I'm like, wait a second, all the technologies that I'm fascinated by there, all of these wallings and enclosures and these violences were, of course, field tested, right? Here too. And there's this deadly exchange between the IOF, between ICE, La Migra, and the Tucson Police Department. And so forcing myself to start to interrogate like what's going on in my backyard more deeply, and then finding more connection with what's going on over there has been my current process. And understanding the walls there through the walls here, and vice versa. It's like very fluid. And I've had some people tell me like, and this was maybe before October 7th, but more explicitly, they've said like, you can't compare the two sites. And it's not about like comparing the exact same kinds of violences, right? It's not that there is this Nakba here and a Nakba there, and they're a carbon copy of one another. No, but the $1 billion contracts, it's the same kind of missiles being developed and tested. It's the same kind of xenophobic policies. And so understanding that is how you can really see that the two are in many ways inseparable from one another as a settler colonial project.
Yeah, the links are so material, right? Like you don't. I mean, like let me get at it this way. So you how did what did you discover by looking in your backyard? Like, what are some of the connections that you discovered by looking at your own backyard, right? Tucson, University of Arizona, with settler colonialism and genocide in Palestine.
Sure. Well, there's like the actual traces that I find like with my fingers and my toes in my literal backyard, but then of course there's like diving deeper into like archival work and like city records and things like that with the University of Arizona and the city of Tucson. I live in the Dunbar Spring neighborhood, which is like right in downtown Tucson. We have this, like, we rent this, beautiful, like 100-year-old adobe house. And, this neighborhood was built up by the Black and Chinese migrants that built the Union Pacific Railroad line. And so, it was this, ongoing dispossession and displacement and exploitation downtown here that built up the city, that paved the way for all of, this like transnational fortressing that gets shipped across the globe. And so you'll find like less so now because we've lived here for quite some time, but there'd be like old bottle caps. My neighbors have found bones. And, there's just like these actual sort of archaeological traces of the violences here and of, the gentrification and the exploitation here. The fact that I can almost see from my backyard, maybe if I like stood up on a cinder block or something, you can see the Caterpillar headquarters that was built a couple of years ago. And, just across the street, they're working on this like downtown links project or whatever they're calling it, that's been ongoing for years, where they're building a road that cuts under the railroad and this and that. And it's all Caterpillar equipment. So, you can think, if you then sort of zoom out, you can think about the copper rushes, the gold rushes, and all of the mining, the open pit mining that's taken place here, that's decimated the aquifers and so forth. But then, of course, you can think about the Caterpillar D9, armored bulldozers that raise Jenin, that, are plowing through Columbia at any given day. From an archival perspective, or even just like a basic internet search, really, it's not that hard to find the traces of these crimes. Like you just like look at the Arizona Daily Star or something, but it's like, the universities. This is why I don't get hired by anybody, but like the university's collusion with death making and with genocide, right? They have these long-standing contracts with Frontex, long-standing ongoing contracts with the Department of Homeland Security. And of course, then we saw in action its collusion with Tucson Police Department and the Sheriff's Department, and the bomb squad that came, or like riot squad, and the chemical munitions that they deploy on the encampments. And so, man, I don't know. It's like the walls are I can't not see this fortressing in every iteration. I can't not move through this city and see like a saguaro that's been like an arm chopped off to make way for the window of a strip mall, or, like the way that the Caterpillar equipment is parked right at the end of my block. And it's just this whole landscape of death making. It's like they'll go through these great lengths to just decimate this fragile desert ecology. And then, as an afterthought, or like as a like generic brand Band-Aid, they'll slap on as like, we're harvesting rainwater, or we're, putting in some more solar panels, and or the land acknowledgments that are in every email, including the email that I received when they're like, we're deploying chemical munitions on your students, and, they're a Hispanic serving institute and a land grant grab institution. And I don't know, none of it makes sense. And so I guess like going all the way back in the way that my brain does, that is like how I'm writing through all of this. It's like just trying to make sense of it, because the scope and the scale and the speed of the horror, like so much of it is so blatant and unavoidable if we're attuning to it. If we're opening our phone and we're changing our privacy set, or our like political content settings and all this, and we're actually looking and seeing what's happening. It's right in front of us, but also it's like literally on, the heaving sidewalk in the neighborhood. And so it's like these different degrees of attunement and learning to read the land, and the way that the land's constantly being hurt too. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think reading, especially your article on the University of Arizona, like you present Tucson, it's like a contemporary, like a neoliberal frontier town, right? That is where you have Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and these, defense contracting companies who only exist because they get money from like billions of dollars from the federal government to create instruments of death. But then these companies are so tied into a land grant university that is the University of Arizona. So it's like this like neoliberal frontier town that's accomplishing the same things, similar things that 19th century frontier towns were designed to do, right, in the so-called West. So it's really like that article is to me was crazy, just to learn all the different, like how these defense contracting companies were tied in to University of Arizona, but just tied into the city of Tucson, to the extent that what would happen to the city of Tucson if these defense contractors left, right? Like it says something about the current political economy of the United States in these college towns or rural towns that depend on prisons or depend on private military contracting companies that are getting money directly from the from the U.S. government. like they're the ones keeping these college towns or rural towns afloat. It all predicated on what? On borders, on walls, on death, on genocide, right? I mean, that's but borders also, and this really comes out in your work, borders are also not just like negative in the sense that they're trying to prevent people from getting in. They're productive, right? So you have that great line where you say that the border is a billionaire. Like it's productive, right? It accumulates capital in spreading death throughout the world. It's accumulating capital, right? Concentrated in a small group of people, whose reason for existence in a place like Tucson is to say, we keep your economy afloat. Like if we leave, then you guys die as a town, right? Or at least that's what their argument is, right? I don't think it would, right? I think Tucson folks are a bit more creative, right? Like there's all sorts of different possibilities. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, Raytheon is Tucson's largest employer, followed by the University of Arizona. So, it's like they're bedfellows in this destruction. And I think about that often. And, I had a conversation with somebody earlier last week where they're like, well, what, what would it look like if Raytheon left, or what are the actual sort of pragmatic steps to border abolition? And you're right, it's a creative city, and not in like the gimmicky UNESCO sense of it, of like a city of gastronomy, because that's just another, that's just neoliberalism by a cuter name, or by like an Airbnb name, whatever. Like what draws you to the city as a tourist. But there was and is so much life here before all of that. But at the same time, so like I write in a lot of pieces that, this is the city where the bombs pay the bills. And practically that's true, because, Core Civic, like you said, the prison industrial complex, and the defense contractors are who is paying the bills, but they're also who's poisoning the land, right? They're literally, so, we're like, what kind of life would you have beyond Raytheon? Well, they've done so much to kill off life in the past, the present, and of course it's affecting the future. They've been dumping VOCs, volatile organic compounds, into the land, into the arroyos for, I think it dates to 1919, when they began to use large tracts of land, for old aircraft here, like just for it to go rot. But then when Howard Hughes moved everything from California to the south side of Tucson, in the 1950s, and then, sort of Raytheon missiles, that whole spiel was born. And, they began dumping all of these toxic chemicals into the landscape. And, people on the south side, already blighted, there's documentation of seizures and the exposure to premature death, right? So it's these carceral racial capitalistic logics of death making that are just like so intertwined, that because they've caused so much damage, permanent damage, I would argue, it's like, how do you can't get back the 200-year-old saguaros that have been raised, or, like, how can the aquifers ever heal themselves back to the way it was? I don't think so. But it's like, how do you then imagine life beyond that? Like it's, I don't know. I don't like practical steps. I don't know. We have to stop shipping the bombs, for one thing. Like, we have to stop making and shipping the bombs before we can move on from anything. But it's like, how do you heal a people and a land that have been poisoned for generations, while concurrently putting in the work to imagine new futures? It's a lot of work,
Yeah.
And there are people doing it,
Yeah.
of course, but
Yeah. And I think, when the university encampment started, there was like normie conversations about, why do college students care about what's going on in Gaza, and why are they using university spaces as a place to like voice their criticism and their
how dare
protest to
they?
this
Yeah.
genocidal war, right? I mean, the obvious reason, especially reading your New Inquiry article on the University of Arizona, it's like, these universities are fully invested in this current genocidal project. Like, we don't have to. I mean, obviously, if you get access to their investment portfolios, and these so-called public universities like mine and yours, but in the case of like University of Arizona, you don't have to look that far. Like, they're so integrated into like Raytheon, into the very military contracting companies, weapons companies that are shipping the weapons to Israel, right? Like, it's not a mystery, right? And then you have very brave university staff, students, faculty, community members who organize an encampment at the University of Arizona, and they face the full brunt of the state, right? Like the state without its ideological mask. They face the police that in some instances, I know of Phoenix PD has a program where they send cops to Israel and back. I don't know if you know about Tucson PD, but there's one line that really stood out to me when you were describing what these brave protesters faced at the University of Arizona, where the chief said, right, like, you are, if you do not disperse, you're going to receive chemical munitions. Like, that's striking use of words. Was that like Tucson PD or was that campus police? Because if it's campus police, that's even more insane. But obviously, it's still like it's quite a thing to say, right?
I don't want to misspeak in terms of like who said what, but and also I don't even know where that is like on the legal spectrum.
Don't
But
offend the cops. Yeah,
don't
don't
offend
offend.
the cop. No, okay. So I still, even though I don't know if you want to call it in between contracts or no, there's a hiring. Okay. Well, there's a hiring freeze at the University of Arizona because of mismanaged hundreds of millions of dollars, right? But of course, they have, another 5 million for a new athletics director and new golf carts and this and that. Side note, whatever. So I'm not teaching there right now, but as I mentioned, I'm a 3-time student. I earned my doctorate there, and I've been an adjunct and a researcher there, and so I still get those updates. I haven't not, especially when a professor was murdered in cold blood, broad daylight, last October, 2 Octobers ago already. These like UA police text messages still show up. And so when the encampments first blossomed, I was clinging to those and also to like my trolling Twitter feed and, all these like other sort of update spaces to see what was going on because I wasn't about to, and maybe that's my shortcoming, to go there because I knew they were going to deploy weapons. Like I just knew it. And even though it's less than a mile from my house, I sensed it and I knew that it was going to escalate and that the clampdown would come so fast. There were 3 iterations of the encampment, and the first one, and I mentioned this in the new inquiry piece, but the first one was right in front of Old Main, so right in front of the main administration building. It was already starting to get really hot in May, and a group of students and allies set up there, and they turned on the sprinklers, and everybody's like, hell yeah, like.
They did that here too. It was so crazy. They did that at ASU too, and here at ASU they used the 5-gallon water jugs and they put them over the sprinkler to catch the water.
I
It was
know
great.
the five
Yeah.
gallon jug is the hero of the moment,
Oh
but
yeah, totally. Yeah.
yeah, and like, oh my gosh, those Humboldt students are so brave too. But yeah, so they turned on the sprinklers, and I wasn't there for that moment, but I was following along, and I was like, okay, this is great. This is fine. Eventually the water will shut off or whatever, and everybody will get muddy. But that also, there's like a bigger story there, and like making the desert bloom, and how we have to have this like meticulous green lawn that's all these non-native species of plants, the flora that's all around the campus. So that's a whole other conversation. But they turn on the sprinklers, they say like you have to disperse, blah, blah, blah. And so that was clamped down right away. And then the second version, I believe the next day, blossomed under the olive tree grove, right at the entrance to campus. So like right at Parkin University. And I visited that one before nightfall because I just sort of had that instinct. Like I knew that as soon as the sun set, they weren't going to have it. And sure enough, that was like when I got the first text messages like disperse or chemical munitions are about to be deployed on you. And, like I've taught entire classes on tear gas, and I actually had students there who texted me the following morning that were like, thank you for preparing me. And like the perversity I mean, not like they're beautiful people and like they're so brave, right? But like the fact that my alma mater, right, is tear gassing its current students, and they're thanking me for having taught them about disproportionate use of force, right? About like the long-term effects of chemical munitions and CS gas, right? And how like these supposed non-lethals are in fact extremely lethal, like sound cannons and pepper spray and all of these other, tools in the cache will cause lifelong harm. And I was just weeping. Like I was just weeping the whole time. And I'm like, this isn't what maybe it's about what being an educator is, but also not. Like my students are saying, thank you for teaching me about tear gas, like being exposed to tear gas when their school is tear gassing. It's just so perverse on so many levels. I don't know. And then there was the third iteration that was even more violent. And then that kind of shut everything down because that was the eve of graduation. And they're like, don't worry, commencement will continue as planned. And great.
It really stood out. I mean, almost every single university responded in this way, right? This just almost no attempt to quote unquote dialogue, right? We're supposedly we exist on spaces known for intellectual exchange and the free marketplace of ideas. All this bullshit, right? But almost every single university responded with police brutality and violence against their own students. So why do you think that was? Like you kind of get at this in your article on the University of Arizona. Like why why this type of just brutal police response to nonviolent um, students and university community members who were there to protest a dissent.
I don't even know if I'm a voice to be able to speak to that necessarily, but I just think that it's their version of zero tolerance. And like you said, just an absence of wanting to engage in dialogue. And it is, the full it's Zionism on full display, it's settler colonialism on full display. It's, the capitalist imperatives of like, well, the Tucson Police Department has all these weapons, and if we use them, then we need to write for more money and for more weapons. It's like they have them, so they're going to use them. And I think that like they're just foaming at the mouth for this kind of violence, right? Because that is what a police state is. That's what fascism is. And if they have the tools, they want to play with their tools. Like not only does the Tucson Police Department have like Hummers and Corvettes or whatever, but they have like all these incredible deadly weapons. And so it just, to me, it seemed like a prime opportunity to flex that and to just say like, especially since schools like Columbia, like Humboldt, like, even the UCLA campuses and some of the other UC system and CSU, of course, they were showing sort of they definitely were showing perseverance. That's Sumud, right? That's steadfastness. Like, we're not going to go anywhere. We're going to occupy more buildings, so on and so forth. Because the collusion runs so deep here and is so profitable here. No, but I guess I'm just saying, like, it was a prime opportunity for them to flex what they had, and just to show that we don't have the time for this.
Yeah, I mean that's not. It's just we're not gonna like tolerate it at all, right? And like I guess as you mentioned in your Arizona article, we're one of what 38 states where it's illegal to engage in BDS, right? So that plays into this as well. You're also, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you're within that 100-mile constitution-free zone that the U.S. has on its borders, right? So I don't know if at U of A they had other federal police agencies involved, or if it was just like campus police and Tucson police, but they could have justified, right? They could have justified deploying Border Patrol or DHS or whatever, because you guys are in that zone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that transpired at UCSD in San Diego.
Right, right. That's right.
I recall seeing people being like, "Don't come to campus," if your status is vulnerable. And so it's various scales of intimidation, and the violence sometimes is just so brute and unavoidable in its excesses. But other times, the silencing, right, the not hiring or the not renewing contracts, like there's the more quiet ways to go about it too.
Yeah, yeah. These, yeah. I mean, I think in that article, in your University of Arizona article, it's you lay out so clearly the economic and the political connections that are enshrined in this university that would then lead them to respond in such a brutal way. And it's not. I don't think it's unique to University of Arizona. I think one of the things that might be a bit more unique again is it's so obvious to see all these like defense contractor companies that you search for on the Department of Defense website every day, as we've texted before. So and the fact that it's within this like so-called constitution free zone, it marks it as different. But it is striking that that was one of the constants across the country, that there was very little to no space for any sort of like actual meaningful dialogue. It was just completely shut down. Whereas summer of 2020, I remember getting a bunch of emails from the university about, oh, we're going to be all about Black Lives Matter now, and I was put on an advisory committee to like teach, offer suggestions on how to make the university less racist. And obviously, like the people that were on the committee working together, one of the first things we thought of was like, well, let's defund campus police. Why do we have such a massive campus police? We don't have a sexual assault crisis center. We don't have any of that. Let's transfer funds. And like that was the first thing we got back was like, you guys can't touch the police. So it's like it's that huge contradiction between having a land acknowledgement and then also being partnered up with these horrific defense companies who are sending missiles and bombs and all sorts of different technologies to try to exterminate to commit genocide against Palestinians, right? I mean, I think that's reading your second article is when I finally started to put that together, right? Like this is why they're so brutal, because these encampments are really exposing what universities, public or private, doesn't matter anymore, really, what they're all about. And they're vehicles of capital accumulation, and depending on their location within the United States and their relationship to local political economies, they're nonetheless involved somehow in like local and global plundering regimes. You just get to see it more plainly, right? Because you're in this borderlands region.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I believe that. And I think that we're also seeing sort of collectively how if the US government is truly just like a bunch of defense contractors stacked on each other in a trench coat, that, these different universities and their chancellors and their provosts, they're in there too. They're all like sort of hovering on one another, and their endowments and their investment portfolios, like you said, it all attests to that. It's documentation of that. And so I think that they're also increasingly going to make some of that hard to access. And I think that the timing of these encampments, while it was so beautiful in terms of like what sprung forth at the different graduation ceremonies, I think that it was also very favorable for that kind of repression, because they're just like, okay, let's close the door on academic year, 23, 24. We're going to start fresh. I'm sure that they're all in some kind of like crisis conference center right now about how they can best, silence all of that, elide all of that. And even the Board of Regents, the Arizona Board of Regents, they're doing that right now, where they're toying with this whole idea of like, if you support so and so, you're going to be deemed a terrorist. So whether it's like you're part of JVP or SJP, or even if you utter or write the word Hamas, suddenly you're going to be. And I think they even say like, we're going to sanction your group. So it's like, oh, the student groups and their friends and allies who are in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions are going to be sanctioned by the university that they're paying astronomical fees towards. Sure.
It's insane. I mean, right now at ASU, the Mecha chapter has been suspended since last spring because they gave a really powerful public presentation on settlers. But also, like, so thinking about Arizona, I'm thinking about reading your work. Arizona as an Anglo settler space, it's always been like this, right? Like this has always been its function. It's just depending on historical context, it functions in a different way, right? So one of the things that stood out, I think it was your Arizona University, or maybe it was your first article on Pause and Possibility, when you mentioned Fort Huachuca. And I've written on Fort Huachuca before, and you can kind of trace the history of border violence and settler colonialism in Arizona by following Fort Huachuca, which was this fort that gets set up in the 1870s as a way to fight against Apaches, which is really truly like the U.S.'s longest war that always gets like left out. But that's from the 1860s to the 1880s. The U.S. military wages war on different Apache polities in Arizona. And one of the first technologies that they bring in the late 1870s to fight against the Apaches are these like heliographs, which are like mirrors that they put on top of mountains to signal, right? So it's like their version of a drone. And where do they get that from? They got it from like the British in their different colonial experiments in Africa and India, right? So, and you follow their history throughout the 20th century, whether it's during the Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century, to like Cold War stuff, to a lot of the wall and border technology they try to apply in Vietnam gets developed at Fort Huachuca, to now it's like the world's largest, or one of the world's largest drone training bases. Like it's so like reading your stuff really gets me to think about whether this is this has always been like the settler function of Arizona to a certain extent, right? There's so much history of this type of violence, of plundering, of walling, of bordering, which makes it, there's obviously physical effects, like you mentioned, right? The poisoning of the ground. But there's so much of this history here that, I mean, obviously that's going to have an impact in terms of trying to reimagine like different futures. Right. I mean, there's different groups of people throughout this history of Arizona that have offered different futures, different visions of things that the way that we could reorganize lifeways in a more just and egalitarian way. And those are the ones that get crushed, but they're there, right? Like as scholars, as politically committed scholars, maybe that's part of our work, right? To excavate these lifeways, right? That get crushed by a state that gets set up to be a settler colonial state from the very beginning. I'm referring to Arizona. Um, but it's a palimpsest, right? So like we just got to like find them. But yeah, reading your work, really like thinking about it as a historian, right? Like it's historians generally don't do this and we get shit on for doing this, right? In terms of flattening out the complexity of the past. But like it's the same thing in Arizona. It's just that obviously context matters and all that, but you see these through lines. And I remember when I was researching my article on Fort Huachuca, Fort Huachuca has a museum. And one of the things they used to have, I don't know if they still have it in their museum. I want to travel just to go check this out. They have a piece of the Berlin Wall. So this U.S. Military fort that starts as a fort to fight against the Apaches, that is called the Guardian of the Frontier. That's its nickname. In its museum has a piece of the Berlin Wall, right? Which is just like, come on, that's like too much.
They're so weird.
It's,
It's
yeah,
in their
it's so
terribly
weird.
arranged exhibition. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating and also weird about the fort. And then it also makes me think about the optics industry, that is multi-billions of dollars here. And so much of it, at least in the past, the last 20, 30 years was predicated on like, oh, Southern Arizona has these beautiful clear skies free of smog and pollution, not unlike, or instead of, Vegas or LA or Phoenix. And so, you have these telescopes, right, on top of Mount Graham and, dotted across the desert, not unlike in Hawaii. And, it's just, of course, land grab by another name. And these optics are also being used in, in the laser diodes, like these same manufacturers, I guess what I mean, that are working with the telescopic technologies and that are working with setting up all of those technologies are also going into, drone and laser guided missiles and things like that. So it is very flat in that sense. It's like a manifest destiny 2.0, or rather, it's just a continuum of manifest destiny. It really never ended because it's just by another name or by another iteration or by whatever resource is the hot one to grab. And right now, and I won't bore us all with that, but like I'm really interested in what's going on with lithium right now because there's like this whole thing down by the Raytheon missiles plant where now the American battery factory is investing $1.2 billion. And they just broke ground a few months ago for this like gigafactory. But it's all about, this like vertical integration of like, we're going to have this like clean eco, super reliable source of energy now while everybody's driving a Tesla, but really it's like in the Department of Defense's strategic plan for 2023 through 2030 to have unfettered access to lithium, right? And so,
The Southcom general loves talking about lithium and lithium triangles. What's her name? General Laura Richardson. She loves talking about lithium. Yeah, right. It's interesting, and there's not going to be a border for lithium, right? Because just south of the border, there's huge lithium deposits as well in Sonora.
so
That
that speaks to the Sonoran corridor, right? So now they're
right,
going to connect
right,
this like
right, right.
transnational
Yeah,
borderless flow, just like the World Cup is going to be so borderless. But this borderless flow of lithium and anything that's needed for it, sure.
yeah. It's gonna be no. I think when you talk about verticality, I think that's manifest destiny 2.0. It's like a vertical manifest destiny now, right? Like it's a 3D one. Because we didn't even get to this, but there's also like the tunneling, right? So um but yeah, that's going to be really interesting, particularly since supposedly Mexico's lithium will be nationalized. We'll see. I mean, so it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be something to keep an eye on, because just to get that going on the Mexico side of the border is going to require like just immense ecological destruction. Um, especially with water. But yeah, we could talk about that for a long time. Um, yeah, we should. Now I'm thinking of that famous painting of Manifest Destiny, and
What
I'm
with
trying to
like
think
the
of how.
angel? I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Is
How
that
can we
the
make
one?
that like politics of verticality version of it?
Right, 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 right. And I failed my
Oh
art
my
history
goodness.
classes remembering the name of that piece. Um,
Yeah, I
but
cannot
yeah,
remember.
I'm sure that there's some way to recreate it where there's just like the gigafactory down below with the raised land, and she's just like angelically, dropping your battery into your Tesla.
And then the tunnels kind of taking the ground from underneath her. I mean, that's it. So let's bring it back since we've been talking for like an hour. Let's take it
Sure.
back to let's bring it back to Palestine and to Gaza,
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and to your first because I'm still like I don't think I'm ever gonna be able to stop thinking about your line about they just hang glided over that damn wall. So what are your thoughts now since you wrote that article? What are your thoughts on we haven't seen hang gliding, but we've seen a lot of tunnels and a lot of one of the things that really strikes me seeing this whole genre of like resistance videos and what the red triangles become a symbol of resistance. I think I saw something last week that the Qassam Brigades one of the factions is going to name one of their rockets like the red triangle rockets. One of the things that really strikes or stands out to me is to see how the IOF has completely destroyed the urban infrastructure of Gaza, but then in a way they've created a terrain that's suitable for the type of armed resistance that we're seeing now, right? Like the resistance are the ones using the politics of verticality, right? They're the ones walking through walls, they're the ones walking through rubble, they're the ones going underneath. So we haven't seen hang gliding, but we have seen the opposite, which is, I guess, the tunneling, right? And the totally always reminds me of like Karl Marx's thing about well burrowed old mole, right? When he's working off of I think it's Hamlet, right, or Shakespeare's Hamlet. But what are your thoughts on now in July of 2024 since you wrote your piece, the Avery Review piece that was back in December?
I hear what you're saying and how these spaces, as they've been bastardized, right, by these bombings, are in some ways proving more favorable to the resistance's style of, warfare, of defense. I, oh man, what do I think now? It's just so bleak because I really, I see Bisan's update just today where she's talking about how there's nowhere to go. And that makes me think of like, and just a few days prior to that, she was talking about, the sky is liberated because many people were flying, like hundreds of kids were flying kites for a moment when perhaps there was like some silence in the air without a drone or without a bomb. She said, I think it was like the sky breathes in resistance, or the sky's already liberated. Um, but then just a few days later, she's showing like wounds on her body and cutting her hair and just like all of these documentations of pain and suffering. And I I can't comprehend how 270 plus days into this you press on. Like, I truly can't fathom that. And I don't think that any of us are in a place to theorize that and to continue to talk about, oh, Samud this and Samud that. And like, we love to share these videos. I say we very broadly, of course, like I'm not pointing fingers, but like we share these moments of ingenuity and how the tents have been turned into shade structures, as summer is in its hottest moments. And it's like, I think we like that because it's making us feel good. I think that we like to share that because it's sort of like assuaging our discomfort in all of this, but we're not actually there and feeling it and breathing it. And like, I just can't fathom how you press on without food and without water and without sleep. And so, I can't really speak to like what the next wave of Qassam's plans will be. I'm certainly rooting for them, if I'm allowed to say that here. I don't know, but like, long live the resistance, right? But that's probably going to get cut out. But it's like I something that's been plaguing me is how we're now almost at 9 months of a genocide. And so any babies that were conceived prior to October 7th have either been birthed, right, or have been slain in utero, or have died from malnutrition because their mother's breast milk has dried up. And so to me, like, that speaks to perhaps, and I know that there are like the 10 stages of genocide, and I'm not fast on my feet enough to recount all of that, but like that seems as though the ultimate goal of like no more babies being conceived, right? Like you're ending life in that sense. Like, how do you my my brain doesn't know how to understand that. And to me, I guess that is what genocide is, right? And so it's that annihilation of the present and of the future.
And the future, yeah, that's the part that gets me. That aside from being like a parent, it's the idea that they're genociding the future. They're leaving tens of thousands of kids with amputees, right? Like, so even if they survive, there is physical and emotional and mental trauma that they're going to survive with. Like, for me, what sometimes makes me catch my, like, I feel like I can't breathe. Like, I feel like I'm having a panic attack. It's to think about this shit is bad right now, but when it finally ends, it's gonna possibly be even worse because of the afterlives of this genocide. It's like not just gonna stop when the ceasefire is declared and when Palestine is free, because Palestine will be free. But it's the struggle is immense, and like sometimes like that's when I have to tell myself like, all right, like chill out, because that's to me, it's to think about a kid who lost limbs as a 4-year old, and then they're gonna grow up like that, like without like the extensive support that they need. Um, that's when I feel like I am like I have trouble breathing. I don't know how else to describe it. Like I feel like a certain urgency, and it's also really depressing. And I asked you that question because when you wrote this in December 23 of last year, you had these really moving lines about infinite pathways to freedom, and you had like possibility of, you talk about the fracturing, the resistance and people's will to live and to survive as fracturing Zionist settler colonial time, and these possibilities of profound change. And I was just interested to see, after everything that we've witnessed since then, like if your thinking has changed, or if the commitment has even deepened alongside just the sheer terror that we've witnessed. And like you said,
Yeah.
we're not on the ground; we are from afar
Right. Right.
witnessing this
Right.
shit.
Of course, the commitment has deepened, and I think that rabbit hole that I was going down was really it's me being mired in imagining being there, not as myself, but just like what these people are going through and what this land is going through. And so I absolutely think that nothing will be the same. There's never going to be a college commencement where a Palestinian flag or a keffiyeh is not waved. There's never going to be a speech that's not interrupted again. There's never going to be, and so in that sense, like, so much progress has been made. And when I was editing, that initial piece, and it was about to come out in December, I'm like in constant conversation with the editors, like, we have to update the death count. We have to update the death count, as if it's like a news bureau. And the immensity of the destruction is just so beyond comprehension that, language just fails in so many ways. But I think that, as a committed ally, as a whatever scholarship I'm able to contribute, whatever pathways to resistance I'm able to contribute to, of course that's only deepened. But I think that the real work and what we actually need to listen to is what Palestinians need from us. Like, what are the demands? And I think and I'm not going to remember the sign correctly, but I'm on one of the tents in the Columbia yard, um, and I think it was like version 2.0 of their encampment. But somebody put up a sign that was like, if you only support or sympathize with our corpses but not with our rockets, we don't want you. And so I think that moving forward, that can be the only way forward, is to listen to what Palestinians on the ground need, and not just in Gaza, but everywhere, right? Palestinians across historic Palestine, all throughout the West Bank, in diaspora, like, what are the demands? How do we center them? How do we amplify them? How do we not co-opt them? How do we not profit from them? Like, that's the way forward in my eyes. And we also just have to stop sending the bombs. We have to stop manufacturing and sending bombs. Like, that truly is my way forward, and that is my only, like, that is where I'm entrenched, is like, what are we blockading, like, what are we disrupting, what flows and circuits are we plugging, so that the munitions stop getting dropped on this land and its people.
Yeah, that's really. I mean, I think that's a really powerful way to end. I think, as you mentioned before, I think college administrators are hopefully going to be lulled into a false sense of security by summer. But as you said, nothing's going to be the same, and shit's going to pop off again in the fall. I know it, and I know some of us will be working toward it. So,
Yalla, yalla, yalla.
so thank you so much, Taylor, for this amazing conversation. We could keep chatting for hours, and hopefully Sina will let us hijack the pod again in the future so we can continue chatting. But I look forward to continue working with you and collaborating with you. And if you could tell the audience like where they can find more about your work, what you've published. I know you already mentioned that you're not really on Twitter or whatever the hell is called now, but if you want to share anything with our listeners.
Maybe we could put a couple of links in the show notes,
Okay,
but
we will. Okay.
yeah. I have a few pieces sort of in the works, but it's really just focusing. I'm just so fixated on this language of forever war, and so I think that hopefully that'll open more roads for conversation about, like, what is actually couched in these contracts, and I would love to hear more from others about what they think too.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely put, especially the two articles that we referenced today, we'll definitely put them in the show notes. Cool.
Cool.
All right. Well,
Thanks, Alex.
thanks. Talk
Bye.
soon.